Russian forces have cleared Belgorod, but the two groups that took part in that raid said there's more to come. And Yevgeny Prigozhin had some hot takes on casualty figures and the potential for a revolution inside of Russia while Wagner withdraws from Bakhmut. But before diving in, a quick introduction or reintroduction of Ryan Hendrickson and the Tip of the Spear landmine removal team. So they're not a sponsor on this channel, and I'm not affiliated with them in any way. It's just a top-notch organization, and I want to try to do my part to share the story about what they're doing. You know, there's been a lot of controversial topics in this conflict, and I know people from both sides are going to end up watching this video, but hopefully, wherever your personal loyalties lie, we can all agree that preventing civilians from being killed by landmines is a good thing. Now, Tip of the Spear has said before that they don't care who laid the mine, but it's their job to dig it up. They're also not connected with or do any work with the Ukrainian military, so it's not like they're clearing breaching lanes for the Ukrainian offensive, but clearing fields and paths so that farmers, children, and any other innocent civilians in the rear away from the front lines aren't killed by these munitions. That's what they're doing every single day, voluntarily risking their lives to save those they never have and likely never will meet. And on a personal note, I can say that Ryan just has a really big heart. He's doing this because he cares and he wants to leverage his experience as a Special Forces combat engineer for good. I'd say he's doing that. Tip of the Spear runs on donations and is a registered 501c3, which means all of their financial information is publicly available. If you have the desire and the means to support their mission, the link to the website is in the video description. So on May 22nd, the Russian Volunteer Corps and Freedom of Russia Legion launched a cross-border raid into Belgorod, Russia that lasted a little over 24 hours. Now, from the start, we've had pretty conflicting reports from the two sides, and that hasn't really changed. The Russian Ministry of Defense put out a statement early on May 23rd that the area had been retaken and that all terrorists had been killed or pushed back across the border, giving a casualty figure of 70, along with 4 armored vehicles and 5 trucks either destroyed or captured. Now, this looks like it was a little premature, as fighting was still reported in various areas for quite a few hours after these remarks. Now, shortly after the return to Ukrainian territory, the RVC and FRL held a press conference to talk about the raid, which sounds a little bit odd, but honestly, it's pretty expected. Whether you think this move had any military necessity at all, it does hold value in the information space. So, of course, the RVC and FRL are going to be posting videos, pictures, and talking up everything they did there. That's where they're going to gain traction, support, and potentially followers. Now, in the press conference, RVC leader Denis Nikitin said that his group had suffered 2 wounded, captured a few Russian vehicles, but didn't lose any vehicles themselves. The FRL in that same press conference put out, quote, "The truth is that the armed forces of the Russian Federation are demoralized and unprepared. They practically did not carry out resistance despite their huge numerical superiority," end quote. The FRL added that total losses for the operation were 2 killed, 10 wounded, and finished by saying that they will return home soon to Belgorod, Moscow, and Vladivostok. In terms of equipment, from what we can see, MRAPs, Humvees, pickup trucks, and a T-72 tank were used in this assault, and a BTR-82 was captured. Now, I'm not overly confident in this number, but as a ballpark, I'd say roughly 20 total vehicles were used in the raid. Now, Russia has released some images and videos showing the aftermath of the attack. The images of 5 to 6 bodies is one that seems a little bit off to me. They showed older uniforms with a different camo pattern than what we saw in all of the videos released by the two groups during the attack. They've also shared quite a few pictures of trucks that were destroyed and or captured during this raid. Now, there are some people questioning those images, calling them fake, that this whole thing was staged by Russia, and that nothing was actually captured or destroyed during the raid. I've followed some of those assessments down some pretty deep rabbit holes, and it gets into things like the angle of the axle after the vehicle has crashed, patterns in the dirt, and lack of blood in 1 or 2 of the vehicles after they were discovered. I don't know. I mean, there's videos of strikes on these columns, so you would expect at least some destroyed equipment. There's also the question of US and NATO equipment being used in this raid, which to me points to the fact that there is a ton of kit flowing into Ukraine, and it probably isn't hard for groups to get a hold of it in one way or another. It maybe even points to a theory I've seen floated out there that there may not be as much top-down control of Ukrainian forces as we think. That speculation is based off the idea that Zelensky may not be authorizing some of these assassination attempts and drone strikes deep inside of Russia. It's not being presented as a way for him to stay clean or have plausible deniability, more that there might be factions within the military able and willing to take action without that direct approval. Again, that's speculation, and even if true, it wouldn't be something Ukraine or NATO would want to publicize, but it's something to think about. I mean, it's not crazy. There's also some arguments that NATO must have facilitated, or at the very least known about the Belgorod operation because of the NATO equipment being used. That could be the case, but I don't think the equipment is the smoking gun it's being presented as here. I mean, if NATO was pushing this raid but wanted it to look like they weren't involved at all, there is plenty of Ukrainian and Russian equipment available that very easily could have been used. However it went down, the U.S. doesn't seem all that happy to be grouped in with the operation. John Kirby, the national security spokesperson, said, quote, "The U.S. has been clear with the Ukrainians. It does not support the use of U.S.-made equipment for attacks inside of Russia," end quote. That's something we've been able to keep relative tabs on so far. HIMARS and Storm Shadows aren't being handed out to anyone with the Ukrainian flag on their shoulder, but the reality is there's enough equipment floating around Ukraine that there is no way to guarantee in the middle of a war that no group will ever use U.S. equipment for cross-border attacks into Russia. Shifting over to Prigozhin's most recent rant, which I kind of have mixed feelings about. I mean, the guy is very clearly looking for attention and certainly has a personal agenda at play, but he also keeps putting out pretty interesting tidbits. Still, though, all of this has to be taken with a grain of salt. In a recent interview, Prigozhin talked about casualties at Bakhmut and the possibility of revolution if Russia doesn't change course in the war. Starting with casualties, Prigozhin said that 10,000 out of the 50,000 convicts recruited into Wagner have been killed, along with 10,000 of his regular contract fighters. So that's a total of 20,000 Wagner KIA during the fight for Bakhmut, which, for reference, is more than the Soviet Union lost during their 9-year war in Afghanistan. He also added that Ukraine suffered 50 to 70,000 wounded and 50,000 killed in that same battle. Be careful with these figures, though. Prigozhin has an incentive to adjust these numbers in his favor, and the opportunity is here. I mean, nobody has a clear picture on casualties, so he can kind of say whatever suits him best. Prigozhin has spent a lot of time recently bashing the regular Russian army and how his Wagner forces are significantly more efficient. So in turn, I would expect him to downplay his losses and increase those from the Ukrainian side. That's likely his bias in this specific report. Now, if that amounts to a rounding error or if he's off by a factor of 10, your guess is as good as mine. Bottom line, both sides likely suffered pretty substantial casualties at Bakhmut. And continuing his recent theme of bashing the Russian Ministry of Defense and how they've executed this war, Prigozhin went on to say that if they didn't get things under control, they could face a revolution similar to those in 1917. Worth noting, these interviews are designed for consumption by a domestic Russian audience, so take that into consideration here. He said that due to mismanagement of the war, quote, "We are in such a condition that we could lose Russia. We need to impose martial law," end quote. I imagine there's a little bit of hyperbole there, but that does seem to be how he gets the media's attention, and, it's working. He talked about how Russian leadership had messed up in the war and that their stated aim of demilitarization had backfired. They've actually turned Ukraine into a significant fighting force. Check out this clip here.
Сегодня, я думаю, что украинцы сегодня это одна из сильнейших армий. У них высокий уровень организации, высокий уровень подготовки, высокий уровень разведки. У них есть различное вооружение, и более того, они работают на любых системах. На советских, на натовских, на чем угодно, одинаково успешно. И они абсолютно философски относятся к тому, какие потери они несут. У них все идет ради достижения верховной цели, как у нас в Великую Отечественную войну, но более технологично и более четко. Поэтому вот то, что сегодня мы получили с демилитаризацией украинской армии.
Finally, he said that if dead soldiers continue to arrive back home while Russian elites are largely unaffected by this war, it's inevitable that portions of the military and then their families will rise up. And conceptually, that makes sense. I mean, of course, Russian citizens at some point will get fired up that only certain segments of the population are forced to sacrifice for this war. There are a ton of factors at play, though, as to whether or not that would lead to any sort of large-scale movement. On a similar note, this morning, May 25th, the Wagner Group announced on their Telegram channel that they have begun to transfer positions in Bakhmut to the Russian military with a completion date of June 1st. Of course, we'll have to wait and see if that actually happens, but it does pass the common sense test, at least the idea of rotating units. I mean, Wagner's been at the bloody edge of this fight for months now, which no shock, really wears down an organization. Even the men coming out of this without wounds are going to be physically and emotionally exhausted. On the other side, it does appear that Ukraine was rotating units through Bakhmut over the last few months. Now, one take on that was that the units were subsequently destroyed upon arrival, so a new one was sent into the breach, which is probably a bit extreme. More likely, it was the rotation of fresh troops in, allowing those holding the trenches to rest and refit a little bit in the rear. Now, that type of rotation really isn't anything new or extraordinary, but it's been noteworthy that the Wagner organization as a whole wasn't able or wasn't permitted to rotate out of Bakhmut until now. It's entirely possible that rotation was done at a lower level with squad or company-size elements moving between highly contested and relative rear areas, but as a whole, the Wagner group has stayed. Now, there has been some speculation that Wagner will be shifting focus to areas outside of Ukraine, maybe increasing their activity in areas where they already have a presence across the Middle East and Africa. But I have a feeling we've not seen the end of Prigozhin in Ukraine. These past few months have brought him and the organization a level of attention that's just not attainable through their operations outside of this war. So they may not end up in the same role we've seen over the last few months, but I'd be willing to bet that Wagner and Prigozhin don't end up leaving Ukraine altogether. But that's all I got for now. Be sure to check out Tip of the Spear landmine removal in the video description. And if you have the means, please consider supporting their mission, saving lives every day in the middle of a devastating war. Thanks for watching. I'll see y'all next time.